Now, friends, this sort of discipleship has a long genealogy in the history of empire, as our Exodus readings invoke. This story narrates the first great tale of conscientious resistance in the Bible. It's set in the context of systematic oppression of Hebrews in Egypt, not unlike the setting of Dr. King's ministry amidst American apartheid. Pharaoh, as with so many imperial rulers across the centuries, proposes to manage the problem of the poor masses by engineering their demise. We know something about that in our own histories, don't we? But paranoid potentates must always rely on regular people to do the dirty work, and in this case, the recruited accomplices choose life. They deceive their superiors in order to protect the innocent. In the grand biblical narrative, these midwives appear only here in this bit part, and yet upon their conscientious resistance hangs the whole history of liberation. And their legacy continues. I think, for example, of my friend Murphy Davis of the Open Door community in Atlanta, Georgia, a Presbyterian pastor and dear friend who has labored for 30 years to expose the connections between poverty and racism and homelessness on one hand, and prison and the death penalty on the other, advocating for compassion and justice on those mean streets and regularly visiting those on death row. Murphy is a modern-day Puah, refusing to cooperate with policies that discard poor folk as so much collateral damage to the grand policies of urban renewal. Or my colleague Alexia Salvatierra, a Lutheran minister, who with clergy and laity concerned for economic justice has stood with low-income workers throughout California. Like Shifra, she has endeavored to save innocent lives by launching a new sanctuary movement, organizing churches to provide radical hospitality to resist the deportation of those targeted by immigration authorities. Or your own Nora Bernard, native activist from the Millbrook Reserve in Nova Scotia, who has been among those pushing Canada to confront its residential schools legacy. Thanks to organizing of people like that and many of you, we are just past the anniversary of the extraordinary official apology, with a whole lot of work to go so that there can be an authentic truth and reconciliation process here in Canada. These are the ways in which people today are keeping alive the stories of many children who Pharaoh forced into displacement, abuse, and misery, with the possibility of healing. These acts of holy obedience by the Hebrew midwives of old were at the same time, of course, risky acts of civil disobedience. The courage required for their work necessitated that these women had to stay awake to the truth of their historical moment. They had to see through Pharaoh's policies of genocide that were, frankly, publicly promoted beneath the earnest rhetoric of national security and economic development and protecting the homeland. This clarity of vision led to them fashioning a sort of underground railroad to save Hebrew innocence, a strategy reproduced some 3,000 years later by courageous African-American women such as Sojourner Truth, who smuggled her people to safety in your fair land, who famously said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if they only knew they were slaves." Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. According to the Exodus story, one of those who benefited from that first underground railroad in Egypt was none other than Moses, whose mother floated him down the Nile to avoid Pharaoh's pogrom. The Exodus story is an absurd mismatch. It's kings against kids, for God's sake. And yet look at that remarkable conspiracy of women that confounds these odds. Pharaoh's daughter gets in on the act, rescuing the child and trumping realpolitik with compassion, smuggling him into the very royal house that despises his people. And then, in an almost comic turn, a Hebrew midwife is called for, and thanks to the ingenious covert organizing of the resistance, Moses' mother is also smuggled in to reclaim her child, and gets paid to boot. Gotta love it. That, friends, is the creative monkey wrenching of the marginalized, who use their hard-earned street smarts to thwart the powerful and to survive. The new leader is given a revolutionary name, Moshe, out of the water. Might that be the water that will later in the story drown Pharaoh's army as they try to pursue Moshe and his people as they march to freedom? This Exodus tale, of course, becomes the pattern for the later birth narrative of Matthew's gospel, in which Jesus survives Herod's slaughter of the innocents because of conscientious magi who refuse to reveal his whereabouts. So does Jesus too begin life as a political refugee, ironically, in Egypt. Such is the paradox of biblical history. As imperial minds plot genocide, God's messengers enter the world at risk, floating down the Nile in a basket, spirited out of the country on back roads. Against the presence of power is pitted the power of presence, Emmanuel. Let me just close with one more analogy. Such conspiracies of resistance make me think of an analogous birth narrative of a modern justice leader. You know, Rosa Parks was an activist who stayed awake and acted for justice on behalf of the oppressed by refusing to move on a Montgomery, Alabama bus in 1955. Her action sparked a citywide bus boycott that overturned, eventually, transportation apartheid. This movement was led by poor working women who midwifed into the struggle a rather reluctant young Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King. This movement, of course, in turn inaugurated the greatest social movement in our history. Dr. King midwifed by women into the movement. These brief reflections remind us just what it is we are to be watching for as we keep vigil with Jesus and the angel of history in a world become Gethsemane. I know that the notion of a vigil is difficult for those of us who are activists and organizers and educators. But I do not mean to suggest that we should not continue in our social analysis, our political strategies, our campaigns and actions. On the contrary, we need more of it, much more of it. But only apocalyptic faith can ultimately bear the weight of history, and it requires those two disciplines. On one hand, to resist resignation to the world as it is, to stay awake to the overwhelming, often numbing issues of violence and injustice, to shake off the exhaustion that comes with the epidemic of alienation and prejudice, the domestic war against immigrants and the international war against real and imagined terrorism, to refuse to sleep through our current ecological crisis, and on the other hand, to awaken to hope, resisting the temptation to despair that history cannot be any different. Another world is possible, and our sisters Shifra and Puah and all who have danced defiantly in their footsteps through the ages, including your beautiful selves, may we keep this vigil. That is our discipleship. Thank you.